Welcome to the 7th lecture. This week we'll learn about two belief systems that were being promoted in the late 1800s and early 1900s, William James's functionalism and Titchener's structuralism. Now that we've finished the first two modules, we know more about how psychology was established. For the rest of the semester, we will cover specific perspectives and subfields of psychology, starting with structuralism and functionalism. We'll start by learning more about who Edward Titchener was and how he contributed to psychology. Edward Bradford Titchener was born and raised in England. Eventually, he would become a psychologist and found structuralism. He was raised by his grandfather, who taught him the traditional gentleman's code of the time. This code would eventually impact the field of psychology, including how Titchener interacted with women in the field. As an undergraduate student at Oxford University, he developed an appreciation for the preciseness of the lab, of the laboratory experiments he helped conduct. He mainly participated in physiological experiments, but appreciated the standardization, the structure of the procedures. He would use this standard of preciseness to judge the rest of his peers for the rest of his life. He had very high standards set, and very few colleagues at the time met his standards. He was not well liked in the field of psychology because he was such a stickler for procedure and methods. At the same time, he was promoting something that we try to promote today, which is use the scientific method, follow the rules, follow the procedures, make sure it's standardized, make sure it's objective. In 1892, he earned his PhD from the University of Leipzig. Wilhelm Wundt, the father of psychology, was teaching there at this time, and Oswald Kulpe was also a student at the university. Although Wundt and Titchener had very little contact with one another, Wundt's ideas still rubbed off on Titchener. In the same year he graduated, 1892, he moved from England to the United States to teach at Cornell University in Ithaca, New York. Remember that 1892 was the year that the APA was established. When he came to Cornell University, he brought Wundt's ideas with him, specifically his method of introspection. In this way, Titchener is a lot like William James. They both brought German psychology to the United States in the 1890s. While at Cornell, he would eventually establish an experimental psychology lab and publish. By 1900, he was a major player in both European psychology and American psychology. Everyone knew who Titchener was in 1900. Although some of us are not familiar with Titchener's work, he was incredibly important to establishing psychology as a scientific field of study. I have 6 of his contributions on the next few slides. Let's jump right in with the first one. He founded structuralism sometime in the 1890s. What he was trying to do was identify the structures, the elements of the mind, structuralism. We'll talk more about structuralism later in the lecture. One of the things that you need to know is that structuralism failed. We don't talk about structuralism today. In fact, this may be the first time you're hearing about it. That's because in the early 1900s, it fell out of favor and was replaced by functionalism, eventually behaviorism, eventually humanism. The figure on the screen came from one of Titchener's earliest books. It is an illustration of the structures of the ear. We know that founders are promoters, and Titchener definitely promoted not only structuralism, but also psychology. I have 4 examples of his earliest books. One of his greatest contributions was his promotion of the scientific method in psychology. After arriving at Cornell University in 1892, he expanded the existing lab. He recruited graduate students. He bought more equipment. He published books and articles. He edited a popular journal. He translated the German texts of Wilhelm Wundt and Oswald Kolbe, who also studied introspection, his preferred method. All three of these individuals, Wundt, Kolbe, and Titchener, used some version of introspection. We'll talk about Titchener's version when we talk about structuralism, but just know that he preferred this method and used it quite a bit to study perception and sensation in the early days. Titchener called his version of introspection experimental self-observation, and he trained his participants to introspect. This is a picture of Titchener's lab at Cornell University. I pulled this image from one of Titchener's articles. Despite Titchener's strongly held gentleman's code, he did promote the careers of several women in psychology. Nearly half, 38%, of his graduate students were women, 21 of 56. His first doctoral student, Margaret Washburn, was the first woman to earn a PhD in psychology, and she did this in 1894. He also urged Cornell University at one point to hire a woman psychologist. Titchener was one of the original members of the American Psychological Association, but over time he became dissatisfied with the group. They had different visions for the field. The APA was going in a more applied direction. Titchener was very focused on the science side of psychology. So they had different visions. Titchener was an outsider because he was born and raised in England and educated in England. He also disagreed with the APA's simplistic approach to research. Again, he had a very high standard, and even the APA as a group did not meet his standard. In 1904, he created his own special group and called them the Experimentalists because they were focused on the experimental method. Today, the organization is known as the Society of Experimental Psychologists, and you can see there the established date, 1904. That was the year that Titchener created this group. The members of this group met periodically to discuss their research, new ideas, new trends, new equipment, and they visited each other's labs. But women were not allowed to join the group. This prohibition had more to do with the gentleman's code than it did with his beliefs about women. He knew women were capable of working right alongside him. He had worked with them. He had plenty of graduate students show him that the assumptions about women were false. It's not that he believed the traditional stereotypes. It was his gentleman's code. The gentleman's code says that men cannot drink in front of, smoke cigars in front of, curse in front of, or debate in front of women. Men were not supposed to do these things in front of women. The experimentalists were made up of mostly men, and when they would get together, they would smoke cigars and drink whiskey. That's what they did. He couldn't allow women to attend these meetings because it would violate this code. The final contribution I'd like to mention is his publication of 2 training manuals. In 1901 and 1905, he published 2 volumes of his famous manuals. They were designed to teach undergraduate and graduate students how to conduct psychology experiments. You can look at both volumes in their entirety by clicking on the 2 links. In this figure, you see Titchener's illustration of Wundt's equipment. When psychology was first established in Germany, graduate students learned how to conduct experiments by observing their more experienced peers and asking lots of questions. In the United States, graduate students completed what were called drill courses. They set up the equipment, they conducted, replicated former studies, they analyzed the data, they worked with their classmates to alternate between being the experimenter and the participant in the experiment. So American labs became more hands-on at the turn of the century. Titchener saw this trend and published these 2 volumes to serve as a type of training method to assist the American students in their efforts to learn more about the lab. In his volumes, he describes 2 types of studies, qualitative and quantitative. His qualitative studies involved introspection, some type of recounting one's experience with stimuli. Quantitative studies involved numerical data, things like reaction time and sensory thresholds. Despite the fact that these manuals are more than 100 years old, they are still relevant to us today. There's plenty of information on the hundreds of pages in these manuals. There's plenty that is still relevant to us today. He has all kinds of illustrations. He has step-by-step instructions for how to do basic lab procedures. Very interesting. I suggest you check out both of those volumes. Just scroll through them.